Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On YouTube, subscribe to our channel at Grade Level Reading. On LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, follow us at Campaign for GLR. And on X, follow us at Reading by Third. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. And before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge our enterprise and programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. Your support not only allows us to hold these vital conversations, but also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights, foster connections, and build the CGLR community. Thank you. As we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details to share with you. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to share your name, your city or your state, and your organization. Be sure when you're responding in the chat box to select everyone, or both attendees and panelists, so that we can all see each other's messages and know who is here. We also encourage you to share your thoughts and insights throughout the duration of the webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting any questions you might have in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond to the questions you post, and our panelists will be typing out responses throughout the discussion. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook, and a link to the recording, as well as any slides, bios, and resources, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And last thing, there will be a brief poll that will pop up on screen during Q&A, and we highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And lastly, I just wanted to turn your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Next week on May 27th, we'll be having there will be a continuation of our More Hopeful Futures or Children as Collateral Damage series, this time with a focus on Head Start's track record, promise, and potential to help students. On June 3rd, we'll have an exciting doubleheader where at 12:30 p.m. we'll continue our Kindergarten Matters webinar series, discussing the transition into the kindergarten year, hearing from on-the-ground and policy experts who will speak to the importance of preparing children and families for the kindergarten year. And at 3 p.m. that same day, we'll be discussing the foundation of EdTech, ensuring universal access to the internet in light of the end of the Federal Affordable Connectivity Program. And on June 10th, we hope you'll join us for our Crucible of Practice Salon, accelerating what works in rural communities. Registration links and more information for all of those sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you'll join us. And joining you now is John Gompertz, Executive Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy.
Thanks, Sierra, as always. And I'm so glad folks have joined us today. We're going to be exploring some complicated territory in this session and in the coming weeks, and we're happy that you're along with us for the journey. One of the biggest developments in the education space recently is the fast growth of education scholarship accounts. In a few minutes, we're going to hear some of the details on recent developments, but we should recognize that this is a fast-growing phenomenon at the state level. There's a version of tax benefits for scholarship accounts included in the version of the reconciliation legislation that Congress is considering right now. So if you care about kids, families, and education, and we know that you do because you're regular participants in these sessions, you can't really ignore what's going on here. And our goal with this session and subsequent sessions is to vastly increase our understanding of the ideas behind the various flavors of parent choice, what people call parent choice, the details of various policies that are in play, and the implementation challenges, the results that are produced. That's what we're going to do today with education scholarship accounts. So let me stop right here for a sec. The language in this arena of parent choice is confusing. And we have a bunch of folks who are going to help us sort this out today. There are lots of overlapping ideas. There's lots of language that can be either heard as broad categories or very specific programmatic ideas. That's all part of what we're going to try to unpack and understand better. Today, our focus is on education scholarship accounts, which is one particular approach to parent choice. And in subsequent sessions, we're going to talk more in depth about other flavors. Over time, I expect that each of us may develop a certain set of opinions about the um, various aspects of parent choice, including including education scholarship accounts that we'll learn about today. For now, here's what I'm going to ask. Enter this conversation with curiosity, with an open mind. I think we all have a lot to learn. As the title of our session suggests, through these conversations, our aim is partly to detoxify the conversation about parent choice and to get ourselves in a place where we understand the background, the motivations, the language, the policies, the possibilities, and the concerns. And we can all discuss that with a level of knowledge and balance. As leaders in our communities, in our organizations, that feels like the right space for all of us to aspire to. I want to make a couple more points before we get into our conversation with me today. And bear with me because I want to get this right in setting the context for today's session. As is frequently the case, I think it's useful to remind folks of the purpose and the positioning of the campaign for grade level reading. First, we're unflinching in our commitment to focusing on creating more hopeful futures for children who are coming up in economically fragile families and in under-resourced communities, historically marginalized communities. Second, we recognize and call out the learning and achievement gaps for those children, and to the extent that those gaps were exacerbated by the pandemic. We don't look past this fact, and we're dedicated to finding and then pursuing the policies and strategies that will help close those learning and achievement gaps. And third, the campaign has always believed that parent engagement is a crucial strategy, a central strategy for improving learning and achievement. The campaign's commitment to parent engagement positions us explicitly, unambiguously in support of parent leadership, parent voice, and parent choice. We see it as part of our role, bringing together all of these. Our role and our responsibility is to both elevate and clarify the roles of parents for our key constituency, these economically challenged families. Now, 3 points about this conversation about education scholarship accounts. One is that while there's a lot of talk and action around education scholarship accounts, they're not just one thing. There are various approaches, there are various policies that travel under the same banner. And even the language of the banner changes sometimes. Understanding these differences is important. We're going to try to help with that. Two is that while education scholarship accounts are very popular in this moment, it is still very early days. We'll explore some early research on impact, but there's still a lot we don't know because we can't know. What we do know is that changes like education scholarship accounts can have a lot of unintended, often surprising impacts. And while we may start out inclined towards enthusiasm or towards skepticism, it's worthwhile to remember how much we don't yet know about the impacts of education scholarship accounts. And three, we can't enter this conversation without acknowledging the level of controversy and conflict there is about education scholarship accounts. As with other issues, much of that controversy feels like it's driven by politics more than it is by policies and substance. Our goal is to our best to get past the red hot political fight and to focus on what's best for kids and families, especially those who are growing up in economically fragile families. While parent voice and parent leadership issues are operationally challenged, we see a situation in which the very notion of parental choice has become a hot button issue, as the term choice has been sometimes weaponized in various ideological contexts, from desegregation in the 50s and 60s to charter schools in the 80s and 90s. Our aim, again, is to try to lower the temperature, to detoxify, to take a cooler, more rational look at the various policies, their implementation, their impact, while always keeping in mind our core question. Are the parent choice policies helpful for economically challenged families and their children? And if so, how? And how do we access those benefits? Let me close with this one thought as we get into this conversation. On a recent episode of the Ezra Klein podcast, the researcher from the Brookings Institute said that her finding was that 2/3 of kids in school are unengaged in learning. Now, of course, we could quibble about the exact numbers and exactly what unengaged means. But I got to say, there's something that rings too true about excuse me, that statement. And if you're a parent of one of those kids, it should hardly surprise us that you'd want better for your kid. If you're a parent of a child who's assigned to a school that historically failed children like yours, it's hardly a surprise that you'd want better for your child. In that same podcast, the guest discussed that while the public school system is deeply imperfect, it's also a wonder that is worth cherishing. Day after day, tens of millions of kids between the ages of 3 and 18 attend schools and they get an education. It's something of a logistical miracle that we as a country are able to pull off this feat. And we want to be careful about unraveling or eroding this system that is at once so frustrating, so important, and so wondrous. So that's enough scene setting for me, I think. Let's get to our guests. As usual, we've assembled an all-star cast for this session. I'm going to introduce folks in alphabetical order. As always, full bios are linked in the chat, so I'm just previewing for you who we have with us today. And I have a piece of peanut caught in my neck, which is not great. Okay, Darrell Bradford is the president of 50CAN, the 50-state campaign for achievement now. He leads the National Voices Fellowship, which focuses on education policy, media, and political collaboration. Ben DeGrow is the senior political director for education choice at Excel in Ed. Ben worked for nearly 2 decades in state-based public policy, providing expert analysis in school choice, finance, and more. Colleen Dipple began her career as a public school teacher and is now the co-founder and CEO of Families Empowered, a Texas-based not-for-profit parent service organization that has provided navigation services to over 105,000 low-income families in Texas. Mike Goldstein is a fellow at the Pioneer Institute, where he recently completed a series of podcast interviews with homeschoolers and microschoolers. Dr. Luis Huerta is a professor of education at Teachers College at Columbia University. And Luis's research and scholarship focuses on school choice reforms and school finance policy. Finally, Beth Lewis is a public education advocate and K-12 policy expert who advocates for fully and equitably funded public schools for every child in Arizona as the director of Save Our Schools Arizona. Welcome to all of you, and we look forward to engaging with and learning from all of you. Ben, why don't you come on camera? Thanks for being with us today. And I'm hoping you're gonna help locate us in this confusing conversation. As is often the case in these sessions, I'm gonna try to channel my inner dummy and just ask some really basic questions that may seem obvious, but that also feel a little uncertain and even elusive to me and possibly to others. So let's just start with the words themselves, Ben. You're an expert in choice, but choice seems to have many expressions, many definitions. When we talk about the growth of education choice and we talk about education scholarship accounts, exactly what kind or kinds of choice are we talking about?
So Thank you for the question. Thank you also to the campaign for hosting this event, for the opportunity to share. Um, at Excel and Ed, we think a lot about the importance of policy and how it changes lives. And we work in a variety of student-centered policy areas. And I'm just privileged to be able to work in this realm of choice to help you think about the broad range of choice before we narrow in on ESAs. I could point to our website that we created called School Choice Matters, which is a 50-state resource that really just helps users of all kinds see the range and a value of different choices, how they interact with each other, everything from choices within the public school system through open enrollment, public charter schools, part-time arrangements, to homeschooling, private school choice programs, and the like. So ESAs are located within the realm of private school choice. And if we use that term, it just means any type of choice policy that's going to give parents funding and access to be able to access some kind of a private education option. So that's a good place to start in thinking about the term choice.
Can you say a little bit more? Double click a little on what some of the differences are between these approaches so that we can isolate and talk about education scholarship accounts. What are some of the different approaches?
So in the public realm, open enrollment is going to enable families to attend a school that's outside their zone area of residence, whether it's within the same school district or across school district lines. Probably the most widely used form of school choice nationally, and probably often overlooked. Different states have more robust ways for families to access than others. And again, our School Choice Matters website highlights that ably. When it comes to charter schools, that's going to be another topic that's before the U.S. Supreme Court. And charter schools have been operating, and they're all now up to 47 states across the nation that allow families to access publicly funded schools that are independently governed, but are required to abide by so many of the same state accountability requirements and open enrollment requirements. Then again, to private school choice, these are things that unlock the door for families who may need something outside the public school system. And we often see these in three forms: vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and our main topic today, ESAs, or education savings accounts. Vouchers are the oldest form of choice, emerged in the early 1990s. And people are familiar with this terminology. It gets used a lot. In my opinion, gets overused. But basically, it's a coupon that gets handed to family, and they sign off the check and say, this funding we want to use to send our child to a recognized private school and pay for tuition. That's all it is. A tax credit scholarship has the same effect from the parent side, but on the funding side, rather than using direct state dollars, it incorporates philanthropy from private individual or business owners that fund these scholarships and help students access these options. The most recent form of choice we're going to talk about today, and we can home in on it, is ESAs, sometimes education savings accounts or education scholarship accounts. And this looks different on the parent side. Parents can use it much like a voucher or scholarship, in that they just use it to pay for tuition. But what it does is it gives a new realm of flexibility and parent power to be able to use for a wide variety of expenses. And those variety of expenses look different in other states, but commonly include things like tutoring, therapies for students with special needs, school uniforms, transportation to and from school, curriculum, and so forth.
So, okay, that was extremely helpful. Thank you for that, Ben. Education scholarship accounts seem to be one of the fastest growing approaches here. Why do you think that has grown in popularity?
Well, we can, and I'm sure we can hear more about the origins and history of ESAs. They originated in states primarily around the needs of students with disabilities in states like Arizona and Florida. And so we understand it takes this vision of giving students more opportunity, which all private choice programs do, but homes in again more on the ability of a one size fits one model, and recognizing each student has a kind of a customized path toward finding their educational success. And it was natural to kind of birth these programs with students with special needs, because we recognize that they, a lot of non-traditional learning needs that they bring to the table. And so this was, parents were dissatisfied with what the traditional system was able to provide their students, were able to, again, access these funds to be able to customize education. Over time, this gets accelerated. So in 2020, with the COVID learning situation, a lot of parent eyes were open to the need for something different, a lot of frustrations with the way things were operating. And it was that point that we see a lot of the ESA programs accelerating from these more narrow focus on students with special needs to what we have today, which is 16 states with universal eligibility programs, which means students, regardless of their family income or their learning abilities, any student who would be qualified to attend a K-12 school in the state is eligible for these funds. So 16 states, huge acceleration. From 5 years ago, there were about 20,000 kids, maybe a little more on ESAs. Today, we're probably somewhere in the range of 600,000. So the growth has been fast and has thusly deserved your attention on the topic.
Well, yeah, it's important for us to learn about. In this question about language, tell us what language you use and think others should use to be most specific, to be clearest about what flavor we're talking about here.
Well, we tend to use just the acronym of ESA. Some call Education Savings Account, some call Education Scholarship Account. What the things that unlocks are things like unbundled learning is one way to think about it. In other words, families can take the different aspects of what's out there. And I hesitate because every state's a little different, but typically with ESAs, it's going to be able to allow families to do everything from mix and match online courses, career apprenticeships, a course at the local school district, a hybrid homeschool arrangement, extracurricular activities, private self-taught curriculum, and it gives families access to all these variety of options so they are able to craft what works best for their students. So ESA, customized learning, flexible learning, unbundled learning are the things that we're talking about.
So let me ask you this last question and also sort of tease up a bridge to Luis. I hear all this and I wonder, okay, and I think we'll come back to this question throughout the day. What does success look like for these policies? Yeah, that's a lot of growth. I mean, heck, if you were running a business and you went from 20 to 600, you'd be psyched, right? That'd be awesome. But what's the goal here? And how can you tell if these policies are being successful?
So you've centered us on the big challenge, and that is the fact that, again, these programs are designed to lead us to the fact that education is a one-size-fits-one model. At the Excel and Ed, we understand that these programs combine parental choice and customization, as we're describing, with a level of public funding and oversight. So how do you balance those needs? From different people's perspective, you're going to get different answers. From the parent's perspective, they're going to be satisfied to see whether their child is now an engaged learner, is on a path to success that they might not have otherwise. For researchers over the long term, for the short term, researchers want to look at test scores, but we're seeing more and more that parents are not satisfied with test scores as the be all and end all explanation of how well their students doing. There's a role at the program level to see if test scores will show us if students are showing some level of growth on a norm reference test or something like that. In the long term, researchers want to see is the student pursuing, being accepted in, and achieving in post-secondary measures, whether it's a 2-year college, 4-year college, or some other measure of post-term success. A lot of the programs we're dealing with are so new, as you pointed out. We just don't have a lot of data on that. I think the clearest and best short-term data maybe we have to understand how successful they are is the fact that families are flocking to these options and recognition that they're offering something that they're not getting in their current situation, which over time, as somebody who works in policy, recognize that these ESA policies are not perfect as designed.
Right.
The feedback from how parents are interacting and the kind of demand they're showing encourages us to think about better ways to fund these programs equitably, ensure there's a range of quality supply to meet parent demand, and ultimately to kind of try to meet all these different measures of success.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was really helpful, Ben, to, just to sort of accept the complicated nature of this. I mean, yeah, they're popular, right? But Beanie Babies and Pet Rocks were popular too, and maybe they didn't have that. They weren't that awesome. We probably all have some of them in our closets somewhere that we'll throw away when we move. It's serious business, right? Kids' education and growing up, and um, really enthusiastic about so much of what you said. And at the same time, even your question mark, and also recognizing nothing's set in stone. We're really in early days, and we may need to adjust the dials in various ways. Let's leave it there for a second. And you, Ben, thank you so much. And you set up Luis perfectly to move us on to. Let's start, Luis. Can you join us? Yeah, there you are. Let's go back instead of forward. Let's a little bit of the origin story. Like, where did the broad idea of parent choice come from? And then where did this particular expression, education scholarship accounts, come from?
So the earliest form of vouchers started in 1990 in Milwaukee, and since then has expanded significantly into 3 different forms of vouchers. It is important to point out that in the early stages of voucher programs, one of the goals really was to provide vouchers to kids that were either in failing schools or kids who met specific income eligibility, low-income kids that were in impoverished schools. However, that goal over the last 35 years has been subverted because we have now shifted to full universal eligibility, which we'll talk about in just a minute.
Yeah.
But the ESA's programs have really eclipsed some of the other choice programs. And did you want me to go to the slides now, John, or do you want to ask me questions?
You think that's best? Whatever you think's best.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, because I can give a little bit of history here on this.
Great. Perfect.
If we go to the next slide. Next slide. And I want to invite folks that you'll have this in your materials. These slides are from a report that the colleagues and I released a few months ago regarding ESAs and the use of ESAs also by homeschool families in some states. And Ben already provided us a little bit of history, just the mechanism. I'll just review it really quick again. A conventional voucher, which has existed since 1990, was essentially state money that would go right to the parent in the form of a subsidy for tuition. And then that parent would be able to make their choice to go to either a public or a private school. One of the key mechanisms in these early programs was that, again, there was means testing. There was thresholds or requirement to be in a failing school. Over time, those thresholds have increased and increased, allowing in many states families that are well into the middle class. Also, vouchers required private schools that accepted a child to accept a voucher as full tuition. In other words, they couldn't charge them the residual amount. If a tuition amount was $10K and the voucher was $5K, the school had to accept the kid for that $5K amount. We go to the next slides. One of the other mechanisms, this is something that's being discussed right now at the Fed level. It's not clear whether the Educational Choice for Children Act that's in some of the current congressional legislation is going to be a form of a tax credit or a tuition tax credit or a tax credit scholarship system, or whether it's going to be a voucher. But a tax credit scholarship, and this is something that started to evolve in the early 2000s as an alternative to vouchers, often called sort of a backdoor voucher or a neo voucher. And the way that tuition tax credits work is that state governments would provide donors, individual taxpayers and or corporations, a credit on their tax liability at the end of the year if those organizations or individuals would donate their money to what's called a school tuition organization or a scholarship granting organization. These scholarship granting organizations would then distribute in the form of a voucher or a scholarship to students, any student who signed up with this tuition organization. The key part of tax credit scholarships that was distinct from vouchers was that there was a bit more universal eligibility. There were fewer income thresholds. And in some states, there was the allowance that children that were currently already enrolled in private schools would also then be eligible. And if we go to the next slide, and this is important, this is where we are today. And this is the education savings accounts or scholarship accounts programs. This is state governments giving money to directly to students and parents that can be used for public or no private schools, but also for a variety of other services, whether that's private tutoring, summer camps, music lessons, and so forth. And in some states, there's also an account that there's a residual amount at the end of every year that money is saved by the state, and then that can be used for college expenses when the child graduates from high school. It's important to remember that since 2021, ESA programs have rapidly replaced vouchers and tax credit scholarship programs as the dominant state level private choice policy. As Ben indicated, we now have 21 programs that exist. And some of the existing larger vouchers and other programs have actually been in some states conjoined to create one large education savings account, such as in Arizona and in Florida. In 2023, just a few years ago, 79% of the 111 voucher-related bills introduced across the United States included ESA. So there is a lot of policy activity across many, many states. Awards or scholarship amounts for education savings accounts range from about $4,200 in West Virginia to about $18,000 or so in Indiana. And within these states, participation is widely available to nearly every student who might otherwise attend this public school. This is leading some to describe these as near universal ESAs or neo-vouchers. And I want to be really specific. ESAs promote universal eligibility without income thresholds in most cases, and meaning that any child currently in a private school is also eligible for these vouchers. It's no longer about kids who were in failing public schools or kids who met certain income thresholds because of the universal eligibility. If we go to the next slide, please. So this rapid expansion of public subsidies really raises some critical questions for policymakers and the public, including who public funds are flowing to and how these funds are being spent and how these funds are accountable to public authorities and taxpayers. And this slide is just an overview of the number of programs. We're still talking in these three private school choice programs, vouchers, tax credits, with only about 1 million children enrolled in these programs. That's about 1% or about 1.5% of all school-age kids. In comparison, just charter schools have also existed since 1991, so over almost 35 years. In the charter school model, we have about 3.7 million kids, so almost 4 times as many kids. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. If we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about what we know about some of the evidence around these areas.
Great,
and
that'd be terrific, thanks.
And give you a little bit of more historical context here. So what do we know and what we don't know? With specifics to student achievement evidence, for a variety of reasons, there are no empirical research studies measuring education savings accounts effects on student achievement or other outcomes. Programs are relatively new still and are rapidly evolving, and programmatic differences in allowable expenses and accountability requirements make these evaluations extremely challenging. Moreover, program design means that often little data or any element of program implementation is collected by statute in many cases. For example, the majority of voucher, tuition tax credit, and ESA programs expressly prohibit or otherwise limit government ability to oversee private schools, and fewer than half require private schools to administer any sort of achievement test by state statute. Some states, including Arizona and Florida, have largely eschewed internal and external evaluations and require no information to be collected from program participants. And such policies have meant that little or no data has been available to research, giving them little or no opportunity to analyze program effects. And again, this is by statute in most cases. The research that has been able to demonstrate, importantly, is the fiscal impact of such programs on state budgets. And also importantly, copious recent research on voucher effects on student achievement does allow us to provide some informed predictions about newer expanded choice programs, such as education savings accounts. So what do we know about voucher evidence, which is the more robust evidence that we have around private school subsidies? And studies reporting on the link between voucher programs and student achievement can inform predictions about the likely impact of education savings account programs, which may be characterized as another important and negative effect. So across locations and student types, recent empirical research over the last 8 to 10 years, this is the latest research on voucher programs, has consistently found programs have actually been linked to a negative effect on student achievement, sometimes notably large effects. That means kids who have exited public schools and gone to private schools in several states have actually scored lower than they would have, or than their peers who remain in public schools, or than they would have had they remained in public schools. For example, in Louisiana, reported negative learning outcomes for participating students consistent across income groups, geographic ages, and private school characteristics. And we saw similar negative impacts in Ohio, Indiana, Washington, D.C. as well. It's also important to talk just briefly about what it is we know about private school versus public school achievement in general. For long, there has been the longstanding myth that somehow private schools are exceptional as compared to public and or public charters as well. A seminal study in 2005 and another in 2008 by Lubienski researchers out of University. Well, they actually just recently moved. I think they're actually now in Indiana. This is research that specifically looked at new family background variables within the National Assessment for Educational Progress. The NAEP is a national barometer, a national sample of 4th and 8th grade students in both public and private schools. Sure. It's known as one of the most robust data collection efforts that we consistently do every 3 years in the United States. This research found that private school students, once additional new family background indicators, control variables were used, showed that in math, that private schools kids in private schools scored significantly lower than kids in public schools, and also kids in charter schools also scored lower than in public schools, with the exception of the 8th grade in charter schools that scored equivalent to kids that were in public schools. This research is important because even when we talk about specific research around voucher effects, we have other research that has clearly shown and has been empirically sort of tested here that there is no sort of private school exceptionalism with regards to higher quality in regards to student effects. Very quickly on fiscal effects. This is an issue that's being talked about a lot now when it comes to ESAs because of the enormous cost. And the ballooning cost. We know that in Arizona, the costs have increased in the education savings account in Arizona. The costs have increased from about 1.6 million in 2012 to 90.5 million in 2022. And it's continued to increase. And the projected cost of the program for fiscal year 2024 was 950 million, which was 1,300% higher than had been initially projected by the Arizona Budget Committee in 2022. So clearly, the ongoing expansion of these choice programs has not been affected by empirical data because there is no empirical data on this. Detailing some of the negative outcomes of private choice programs really exists more in the earlier voucher programs. So this suggests that the continual growth of these private choice programs is based more on political motivations that have displaced the actual evidence with particular ideologies, political ideologies, and popular misunderstandings of the purpose of public schooling, which have widened support for private choice programs.
All right, let's come back. That was fantastic, Luis. Thank you so much. Let's come back to that because I think that Some of the points that you just raised are crucial to get into more deeply. And you mentioned sort of the disagreements that are arising and the arguments that are being put forth. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of heat about the wisdom and the efficacy of these policies. So that's why we've asked Darrell Bradford and Beth Lewis to give us a window into the core of that dispute, if dispute's the right word, about the value and impact of education scholarship accounts. Just to remind you, because it's been a minute now, Darrell's president of 50CAN, an advocacy group focused on achievement, and Beth is director of Save Our Schools in Arizona. Thanks both for being here today to help us shed a little light on this whole situation. Beth, let's start with you. Arizona was one of the first states that passed an education scholarship account law. When was the bill passed, and what does it provide for?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the question.
Of course.
Yeah, so Arizona, we have a very choice-rich system. I just want to lay that out. We don't have any kids that are locked by zip code. We have robust open enrollment for district schools. We have charter schools. Our districts have gifted academies, Montessori's, right? We have tons of choice. But we're funded at 49th in the country for our public school students. So a lot of times, we have these choices, but all of our choices are dramatically underfunded. So when the legislature came in and tried to pass universal vouchers, the voters rejected that. They said, we don't want to have this ESA system. We really, we're looking at this, we need to fund our public schools first. 4 years later, after the voters had a say, the legislature came back in and said, well, we don't really care what the voters think. We're going to go ahead and pass this program anyway. So we've been dealing with the impacts of having universal vouchers, which now are set to cost $1 billion for the state next year. We're dealing with those impacts. And I think it's really important to note that a lot of times people say this can be a both and. We can have these robust choice systems, right? We can have vouchers, we can have public schools. I would argue that not only in Arizona, which is really a cautionary tale for the country, but in other states that have passed these programs, unfortunately, the billionaire-backed folks that have been pushing vouchers have gone to the states with the worst funded public school system. And so the devastating impacts are being felt really keenly across the states that have vouchers. Arizona, a lot of folks look at us because we have no accountability. We have no academic accountability. There's no financial transparency. There's no safety oversight. And there's no caps, right? It's not based on income. It's completely universal.
So Beth, I hear your concerns about this, and I hear your concerns about the financial implications of it. At the same time, I have to say that the financial implications suggest that people want this. Like if nobody wanted this, then it wouldn't cost anything because nobody would take advantage of it. So there's something that is appealing to some people about this opportunity. And so can you say more about that? Because I think, as I said at the beginning, the campaign has always believed that parental engagement, parental leadership, parental voice, parental choice are all important parts of, creating the conditions for young people to thrive and to learn. A key strategy for recovery from pandemic, all that we see parents as absolutely crucial. And there are a lot of parents who appear to be voting with their feet in Arizona. So what's the dynamic there? What's going on?
Yeah, no, they're not voting with their feet. 92% of our families are choosing public district and charter schools, right, that have accountability to the public. We are sending 12% of our state budget to this ESA voucher program for only 6% of kids. The vast majority of these kids are kids who were already in private school. They were already home educating. So the idea that people are voting with their feet is just, it's not playing out in reality in Arizona. The reality is people are sticking with their public school, but the other reality is that our public schools are shutting down because of the voucher program. Because we are a revenue poor state, there is not funding for both of these. And that's true across these universal voucher states. The data all shows that the vouchers are primarily going to wealthier families in wealthier zip codes. The zip codes are predominantly white. The vast majority of the funding is going to districts like Scottsdale and Paradise Valley, where there are a ton of very, very wealthy folks who are already choosing private schools for their kids. And there are a lot of barriers for access for low-income families. I'm a public school teacher. I taught in low-income schools for 12 years in Arizona. I saw the beauty of public education and the pathways that it created for our students. So I'm a firm believer in public schools. If I thought that those students were somehow being served by this program, it might be a different conversation, but that's not what's happening in Arizona. In Arizona, we are funding an additional $1 billion for people who had already made a choice to receive private school, could already afford that. And now we are leaving that opportunity cost off the table for all of our public school students who desperately need solutions that work, right? Like, we're all here because we care about kids, we care about learning, we care about third grade literacy. We don't have any supports for any of we don't have early childcare, we don't have early education, we don't even have fully funded kindergarten in our state. Our teachers are paid nothing, we're paid peanuts. So the fact that our lawmakers dug into the couch cushions and found $1 billion for this private program and failed to fund the things that we know work, right? The data-driven approaches that we know actually lead to success for kids. I think it really shows the misplaced priorities here. And there is a very harsh anti-public school agenda at play in our state and other states that have passed these voucher programs.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Darrell, can you come on camera and come off mute? You occupy such an interesting space in this discussion, Darrell, because 50 Can, we know, is a huge leader on student achievement and rigor and all of that. And you're also very interested in what we used to call equity, fairness, and kids who are growing up in challenging circumstances and who've historically not thrived as much as we've wanted them to. And at the same time, you're supportive of parent choice, including education scholarship accounts. So here we've heard pretty vivid, versions of both sides of this conversation, and I'm curious how you and 50 Can see all this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And the hype about your moderating skills is validated. So I just want to put that out there too. So I should just say before I get into anything that's like policy related, I care about this because this wasn't a hypothetical question for me. Like one of the earliest conversations I can remember was my mother and my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table in Southwest Baltimore, talking about whose address we would use so I could go to the middle school I was not zoned for. And I appreciate how much you've sort of zoned in on this. Real families experience this in very different ways than we do in the policy community. And normally when we're talking about school choice, it's like, are you lucky enough to get the school that you want? Are you rich enough to be able to pay tuition? Are you, sort of connected enough to get into a school that works for you, that you're not zoned for? Or are you like bold and daring enough to lie about where you live, which is sort of the most common way that people exercise school choice in the United States? So I just want to throw that out there as the reality of this discussion. Everybody likes school choice. The question is who's going to get it, like who, and how much are we willing to pay for it? And that's kind of the way we think about it. We are multi-issue and instructional people, and I feel like it's really important that I say, we think Arizona is like a bright light in part because it has so much public school choice, open enrollment, the variety of charter schools. This is unique in America, and how people, it's kind of more more evident in the Western states, but in the Eastern states, we don't have like a lot of sort of charter schools that serve high income people, for instance, that kind of things. And that sort of counterintuitively is very important to why charter schools and the 200,000 kids who attend them in Arizona are politically safe, because the constituency for charter schools is very diverse. If you're in a place like I am and have worked like New York and New Jersey, our schools are not diverse, though they are of incredibly high quality. And there's no study that says that they are not, because they are geographically constrained and they are filled with low-income kids of color. And there is as I'm sure you know in your work on the campaign, the politics of that are significantly more difficult than if you have a universal sort of approach or universal problem that lots of different people want to engage with. So I would just say like a couple of quick things, and then if you have any prompts, I would love to dive into them.
Great.
So we're choice people because we value a child's aspirations over their address. And even across our 11 states, we are implementing it in different ways. But we have like 4 states that are working on ESAs. And I think you sort of heard this from Ben earlier. Not all ESA programs are different because states are different. In the same way that not all states measure public school success the same way. We probably have 51 different ways to figure that out,
Indeed.
right
Indeed.
now. And so, in Georgia and Tennessee and Louisiana, those are the 3 of our states, they require some sort of testing, if it's norm referenced or whatever. So they're like, but West Virginia, Arizona, and other places have decided they don't want to do those things. And I think since the programs are new, this is going to be something that states figure out, how much data they want, how much they want to measure the new things as they have measured things that they already have, which is also, sort of an important factor. But I would just say that like for our audience, we should think about the ESA question 2 ways. Lots of people think about it like a school choice, as a school choice question, and it is. And I tend to think about that as like, what device do we want to use to help the next generation of sort of American education present itself in the present? How can we fledge that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a revolution in school finance that exists exclusive of what you use with it. And I think one of the things we want to, get, like when you're talking about ESAs and the fact that basically ESAs and private school choice programs are the only school choice programs that are means tested. So there's no means test for charter schools. There isn't one for magnet schools. There isn't one for, there is one for traditional district schools, I suppose. It's called your mortgage, right?
Yeah. Right.
But for me and for us, we're like, what would happen if you actually moved to a system of school finance that didn't use the housing market to decide how much money your choice was going to be worth, or that didn't weight your address choice significantly more than any other flavor of choice you make on the, from charter school to independent school to go your own way to homeschool, and the last point on this, there's a lot of data that that one could use to argue, maybe with a little sophistry, but I think people will take it in the spirit it's given, that rich families, what they do is they pick the best school they can pick, and then they supercharge it with all kinds of money that is spent outside of school. So since the 70s, like rich parents spend like 2 or 3 more times the money on their kids' enrichment, tutoring, sports, trips, all these other things than low-income families do. Low-income families want to do it too, but they normally don't have the resources to do it. And we think a system of school finance like this is essential to helping to close those 2 gaps in the ways that wealthier families who have figured this out and support their kids in all these other ways, we want low-income families to have that same sort of ability. And an ESA, in this instance, is one of the ways that you can both close that gap and help people find the school that's right for them.
Darrell, that was very useful. I appreciate that. How do you think, and your comments about housing and where people choose to live, we of course know that people who've got less means have fewer choices of where to live. It would be grand if they could live in a great community with great schools, except they just can't afford it. So it's a clever thought about this is a corrective for, we use housing as a proxy for where you go to school. It comes out really unfairly, and this is a corrective for that. I'm curious how you think about you started to articulate this, how you think about the goal here, because for you guys at 50 Can, I've always understood achievement to be the highest order goal, and other things are strategies to reach achievement. And yet, as Luis suggested, as Beth suggested, some of these education scholarship schemes that are, policies that are being developed seem to deprioritize achievement and prioritize something we might call parent satisfaction.
So I think that, I will say, and not even everybody who leads all of our state campaigns is unified on how we talk about this.
Okay, so it's a hard, confusing issue.
We have some people that are still like hard line NCLB style, show me the data, right? And then we have some people that are like, maybe I'm in this camp, that are like, I'm ready for a little more experimentation. I mean, the only thing analogous to what we're going through right now, and someone sort of mentioned it earlier, is the first 5 years or the first 10 years of the charter school movement, where we had a new policy device, we were trying it in multi-state contexts, people had expectations about what might happen, and even there was a prism on pure achievement. And I think a lot of the big CMOs that are particularly good at closing achievement gaps for low-income kids of color rise to the top there. I happen to be a board member at Success Academy. As the kids say, I'm ride or die for it. I'm very proud of what we do. But the device was also supposed to do different, right? That is a different, that's a different set of successes and a different way to measure success. And so I would just say that I think right now, outside of just 50 Can or education policy world period, there is a bigger discussion in America, particularly after the pandemic, about what good looks like, how we should measure what excellence is, how we should prioritize what families want versus how we have traditionally prioritized or measured it, which is to say normally with standardized test scores. Now, at 50 Can, we care about this very much and continue to fight for it. But it shouldn't be lost on anybody that 8 years ago, thousands of parents, in the absence of ESAs or any of this, were walking out of their public schools because they didn't want to take the annual standardized tests so we could know how kids are doing. So to this sort of schizophrenia about how much we want to know, what we want to do when we know it, how we know it, how we define success is something that is not new, but presenting itself in a way that I think is complicated and deserves reasoned debate given all the new optionality that's on the table.
Well, that's really interesting, Darrell. Dana Goldstein just had this piece in the New York Times, and frequent listeners to this program will know that we just had Kevin Huffman and Mike Petrelli on talking about that we've lost the plot on achievement, that we're elevating other things, and those other things may be valuable, but maybe we've taken our eye off the ball of achievement too much, and we're seeing some, erosion of what we've traditionally thought of as achievement. This was great that you brought up experimentation, because now I think I want to switch to our last two panelists to talk a little bit about experimentation. We got one person who's actually done a bunch of research on this stuff, imagine. And that's Mike Goldstein from the Pioneer Institute, and also Colleen Dipple from Families Empowered in Texas, which is actually trying to help low-income families make the best choices and take advantage of the opportunities that are presented. Colleen, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us a little about the work that you're doing in Texas to try to help families take advantage of the opportunities that are presented.
Sure. Thank you so much for including me on this panel. It's great to hear all these diverse voices, and I appreciate being included. So at Families Empowered, we work to close what we call the opportunity gap by providing free, personalized services to Texas families who are seeking school options, right? So we've served over 16 years, 110,000 families. 95% of the people we serve are women. So it's usually moms who, we end up serving. 98 or 89% of our families identify as people of color. And then 59% of our families are living on about $50,000 a year or less. So I want to just sort of set the tables to be really clear on the data and who we serve. Now, we'll serve any family who comes to us, but the majority of families that we serve tend to be low-income parents. And then we do have callers who are providing sort of free bilingual service to families who are looking for school options. And about 60% of the calls that we make are in Spanish. So that's a little taste of who we serve. And so what does it mean that we serve them, right? We provide free bilingual service that allows parents to connect with schools and schools to connect with families. We don't take a position on which schools are best for the families we serve, right? So we believe that all families love their children, right? And we trust that parents are the closest people to the children and that they are very well positioned to make good choices. So we don't put our thumb on the scale on where parents ought to send their kids. We're very proud to have partnered with 14,522 schools. It might be 23, but we had a retreat in January. So this is why I keep saying this number down to the one place. Because I was like, how many schools have we partnered with? We're incredibly proud to have partnered with the Houston Independent School District, Austin Independent School District, San Antonio, Fort Worth. I've met lots of superintendents, charter management organizations, mom and pop charter or sort of one-off charters. We also connect families to private schools. Right, parents are our core customers, so we connect them to religious and non-religious schools. And then certainly for parents who want to homeschool, we make sure that they have information that is accurate and actionable. So we have a point of view, right, which is informed by the work we do. We're not writing white papers. I don't publish stuff online. We're providing direct service day in, day out to connect families to schools and schools to families. Last year, we made about 37,000 individual phone calls. We spent, so we use technology, we use in-person events, and our goal is that our parents, when we say the opportunity gap, I think Jarrell hit the nail on the head, which is that wealthy parents often have lots of resources, but one of those is time that we don't think about. So we're very supportive of all forms of school choice, right? We do feel like if states are going to pass these kinds of legislation, they need and programs. We think it's really important to ensure that parents have neutral service that is not incentivized by one sector over the other, right? So there ought not to be parent service that is just about getting kids into ESA programs or getting kids into charter school programs or magnet school programs. And the individual schools, I do think there's a lot of stress on all of the schools to sort of recruit and find parents. And so we fill in that gap by just sort of saying, look, we're not about fixing districts. We're not about filling charter schools. We're not about filling whatever, making sure every parent uses an ESA. We are focused on serving parents as our core customers. And in 16 years, we've done a lot of listening, and we have actually learned a whole lot about what parents want and don't want. And I think, as Jarrell said, that's actually changed significantly over the last 16 years. So
No, it's
initially,
interesting.
yeah, so I don't know if you have other questions, but I could give you a
No,
little.
well, that's let's stick it right there because
Yeah.
that is a perfect bridge to Mike, who has actually done research on what parents want and parent attitude and parent action. So, Mike, thank you for your patience. You're a good man. Somebody's always got a bat cleanup, and today it was you. So I appreciate that, your forbearance there. You've done some looking at what parents want, what parents do. Tell us a little about what you found with respect to attitudes and actions.
Sure, I'll share a couple stories. So this was for Pioneer Institute, and I did some podcasts just interviewing moms. You have an education savings account. How are you using it? And just
Yeah.
as a backdrop for our community here, most parents are taking an education savings account and using all of that money towards private school tuition. That's the most common use. I was particularly interested in homeschoolers because they can chop it up however they want. So a parent in West Virginia might have $4,900 to spend on a mix of stuff, curriculum, experiences.
Yeah.
And so since this is the campaign for grade level reading, I'll share a quick reading story. So Tiffany was a mom I spoke to in West Virginia. She'd moved to West Virginia from Florida. And I talked to Tiffany twice. One was before she started the school year, and her plan to use the ESA included, she's like, my kid doesn't really like reading. I really want to get him like reading some stuff he loves. He loves Chronicles of Narnia. And I found an online course, it cost a couple $100. He can take with other kids around the country, and they go deep on all 7 books of Chronicles of Narnia. So that was one of her expected expenditures.
Right.
I talked to her 6 weeks later. She's like, okay, that's not what happened in real life. What happened instead, 2 things. One, the guy wasn't teaching that course this coming year, so it wasn't available to her. She also listened to the Emily Hannaford podcast called Sold a Story that I'm sure most of our audience is very familiar with. And she had this reaction. She called it hit me like a Mack truck, because she herself is an educator, where she realized her kid had a big phonics issue. And it was really, so this was a kid who was not thriving in his previous sort of traditional school. He neither socially nor academically, but she thought originally, oh, I'll just kind of get him out of this through interest. And instead she realized, oh no, we have this clinical phonics issue. My kid can't decode very well. He's faking it. It was all the stuff that Emily uncovered in her series.
Wow.
And so mom, Tiffany, found a local tutor in West Virginia. Over this course of this past year, she's paid about $2,000 to this tutor, uses Barton method, which is one of the kind of common highly structured approaches to helping like weak readers get strong on phonics. And I thought it was an interesting story. It was a type, John, that I would call the aspirin homeschoolers, meaning they're often responding to a problem, whether their kid was in a private traditional school or a public traditional school. They knew their kid wasn't thriving in a traditional school. And so they're homeschooling, and then they're using these education savings accounts to try to support that experience. A contrast, and another quick reading story, was I met some moms who were what I would call vitamin homeschoolers. Their kids did just fine. They had no objection to the school nearby. They thought it was fine. They just thought they could do better. And so I talked to twin sisters from Venezuela who live in Florida now. So their education savings account is about $8,000 per year per kid. They were named Andreina and Mariana, both professional. And, you know, they said the benefits of homeschooling, which they don't intend to do all the way through K-12, but they thought it was great, like great bonding, quality time with their kids, getting to know the kids better, doing a lot of fun experiments. And so they felt they had the math, English, science, history stuff pretty much down. So they would do a little expenditure here or there. Like I remember them telling me these books about Greek mythology, and they would get that reimbursed through the ESA. But most of the ESA for them was memorable experiences. Some of those were like, competitive jujitsu, learning drums, that kind of stuff. That, by the way, I do, my wife and I, we pay for our teenagers to get those experiences. They were using an education savings account to get those. But also they came across, I think Ron Matos is in the audience. He profiled this husband and wife team in Florida who started Surf Skate Science. And they have this really cool science curriculum that's live that kids go to. And it's kind of like the really cool science curriculum most kids would love to experience, because you get out into the water, you do some surfing, you come back on shore, you get under a tent, and they teach you some cool stuff. So there were a lot of like memorable experiences being bought with these education savings accounts.
So I think that that was fantastic. Colleen and Mike, thanks so much for just like taking this. There's no moderation necessary. You're just taking us on this journey perfectly and giving us different facets and dimensions to think about, which is exactly what we want. Let's have everybody join the conversation now. And I want to go back to this question that got raised across the board around what we're trying to achieve here. What's the goal or what are the goals, and how can we tell if they're being accomplished? And let's put aside for a moment, I understand the political discussion, and I am sympathetic to why some of that controversy exists in the political sphere, and why there are questions about motives. Sometimes I think we can see some of that, but I want to go back to sort of what are we trying to accomplish, not for systems, but for kids, and how can we tell whether we are achieving those goals? Darrell, maybe I come back to you to start that conversation, because I think this is for me one of the hardest pieces. If we work really, really hard at achievement, we think about closing gaps between kids who are coming up in economically fragile families and marginalized communities and so forth, and all that needs to happen for those kids to thrive, all the challenges their parents face already. How are we judging whether this experiment around education savings accounts is actually serving those objectives?
I thought we were friends. I mean, look, so
we are. That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, no. So okay. So here, one thing is anecdotal, and one thing I think is practical, and I'll just like lean on the charter school example for this.
Yeah,
is that have you ever been to a charter school graduation, particularly like one of the rock star ones? It is a life-altering event, and I say that only to say that it's just a myth that low-income parents in particular don't want what's best for their children. So I highlight that to say we've also spent the last 30 years in like a pretty disciplined way talking to low-income families, families who are at the short end of the stick, about what it should look like if their kids are prepared to go to college, have a career, and take their place in the main alongside everybody else in our democracy. So the first thing I would just say is that I think that's actually an overlooked success of the standards and accountability movement, that parents actually value this information now in incredibly important ways, and they seek it out. They want to know how their children are doing. I think that will have an enormous effect on how people use ESAs, and more specifically, how people who want to provide in an ESA marketplace provide. And
Yeah.
you know, Colleen and I, a couple of years ago, I happened to be in Texas with her, and we went to see like the Houston Dyslexia School, which was a retired educator who was like on fire about the science of reading, posted up right next to an incredibly diverse elementary school, doing structured literacy after school and before school, you know, with using some of the teachers from the school that was next door to do it. And the kids were happy and literate, you know? So I think that's a best case scenario built on 30 years of strong messaging about what your kid should do. And I would just also say, and this isn't because I think she's a hipster, an undercover hipster, and I enjoy her company, but you know, the role of parent navigation, I think, will also become increasingly more important.
Yeah.
You know, people have informal knowledge networks. I know you know this, where you know you go to the person who you know knows.
Sure.
Tell you. But there's a hunger to know more, and I think there'll be more groups like Families Empowered to help us handle this sort of issue.
Yeah. I want to come back to you, Beth, because you expressed a lot of concern about this and about how really what I think about the erosion of support for public schools, that this inevitably erodes support for public schools, financial and otherwise, and therefore you end up with a lot of kids, perhaps the majority of kids, having less, less good options than they would otherwise. Say more about that, because some of these cases and the sort of the history with kids with special needs, it can make a compelling story. So I'm curious how you balance that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that when we have a program like Arizona's that is so universal,
Yeah.
What you're going to see is a huge saturation of additional funding that's going to the folks that are most equipped to make that money grab, right? And that tends
Yeah.
to be more privileged folks.
Yeah.
And that, we can argue about how that's going to play out over time. And there are, great groups that are helping families navigate, but we work with families all over the state who just want their local neighborhood school to be.
Yes, of course.
Right? I mean, we have 1 million kids in public schools in Arizona, and they're shutting down. And 70% of the schools shutting down are Title I. And I think there are huge, equity concerns here at play. I mean, there is rampant discrimination in the private schools that are able to take these public funds in Arizona. It is well documented that schools can pick and choose their kids. And so it's not just about the barriers. The barriers are real, and we need to address those. But
yeah, I totally hear you on that. So I want to come to Ben and to Luis around this, because Beth, I think you're raising your questions about eligibility, your questions about also eligibility on the other side of the equation, like what kind of schools are eligible to, take students? Are they discriminatory in some ways? I think that's all really important. So Ben, as you think about, you said fine tuning around scholarship accounts. How do you think about just the kinds of issues that Beth is raising? What kind of fine tuning do you think might be in order to not have basically tons of a large majority of the money basically siphoned off to underwrite choices that people have already been making, as opposed to creating new opportunities such as Darrell was just discussing?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think of these questions in terms of systems, and then move down to the student level. So we talk about discrimination, right? And in the public school system, the children have access to some public schools based on their residence or zip code, but not necessarily to all public schools. In a similar way, a child who has the added option of an ESA is available to a menu of private schools, but may not be suited to every private school in the system. So the ESA as a net plus in terms of offering options and access, right, to kids who, so every private school may not be available to every child. That being said, when we're thinking about designing universal programs, one of the things that states should be looking at more is not just prioritizing funds for kids who have high needs, but to weight the funds as well. So we want to create universal access, but within that universal access, weight dollars so the students who need extra navigation services, who need extra therapy or extra tutoring support or other things to make up those learning gaps. I think one of the ways you can fine tune a lot of the ESA programs is to preserve the universal eligibility, but to weight the funding to meet the student's need.
Yeah, Luis, I want to come to you on that because in your presentation, what I heard is there was a certain jump the wall quality when people went for these universal eligibility as opposed to targeted eligibility. And it raises all the questions that Beth raised, all the implications around basically a siphoning of public funds for that might advantage people who are already have advantages. As you think about the way choice and these education scholarship accounts go forward, would limiting eligibility or tailoring it as Ben suggested speak to some of those concerns? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. It's 2025. That's got to happen.
I will answer your question by going back to your original question when you came back to the whole group here with regards to what should our goals be. And I think our continued goals when we talk about public dollars that are flowing to pay for education, and just to also ground everybody, remember that in state budgets in most states, education is still the largest single public sector funding, which is about 40% of almost every state budget. But our goal should be to continue to be able to provide free and equitable access to quality education. Let's remember that 90% of our kids are in traditional public or in the public school sector. About 10% of the kids are in private sector. When we talk about access, we have to think about supply side behavior. And Beth hinted a little bit to the supply side behavior. And that is that we talk a lot about choice as being something that empowers parents. But it's important to understand that supply side behavior for school choice, what's often overlooked is that the expansion of private school choice is more dependent on the criteria that private schools use in choosing students and is less dependent, I have to emphasize, it's less dependent on giving parents the ability to choose. Private schools can deny access to any child. There is no state that has any province or governance over how much a private school charges or what criteria they use to enroll their children. That's very important. With regards to parent empowerment and the idea of parents making choices, nobody disagrees with parents making choices. But what is distinct and has to we have to discuss in more detail is whether public dollars should be funding every choice that a parent chooses to make, especially when these are choices of dollars that are flowing to schools, as I indicate, that can freely discriminate and accept anybody they want. And I think that we overlook that supply side. And I would just want to emphasize one last piece that Beth indicated about sort of the erosion of the public sector here. Not just with decentralized models in charter schools, but also in the market model of schools. There's a seductive sell that's been a part of this movement for 35 years from the proponent side. The seductive sell of saying that you will be empowered to make a choice. We're talking about information, but there is no accountability. A market depends on good information. And when we don't have accountability of any private schools who are accepting these kids, and in most cases by statute, it's very difficult to make a claim that we're going to have a market that is equitable and fair to everybody when information is not collected or provided, and whether there's any account for the public dollars that may be flowing to these schools.
Yeah, Luis, here we are 5 minutes from the end. We're right in the middle. I have a million questions I want to ask. I want to follow up on everything, because I think these questions about what's the appropriate regulatory scheme, where's the transparency, so Colleen and her organization sound like they're doing brilliant work that is essentially acting as a broker, because the system itself it's still information, as Ben suggested at the beginning. We're really, really early days, and we're not we don't know enough. And so I ran the Grad Nation campaign for a while when I was at America's Promise. I was part of the team that ran that campaign, and it's a very successful campaign. There were lots of good things about it, but there were also a whole bunch of diploma mills, things that look like Dunkin' Donuts in strip malls all over various states, that with giant signs that says, buy your diploma here. Okay, well, that's not actually a really great use of public money. And so we're also in this tension that I would love to explore more about public good. What's our public interest in education? What's our private, our family level interest in education, educational outcomes? These are super complex issues, and they're also caught up in the maw of a political debate that is really polarizing. It is easy to cast aspersions across the divide, and we're trying to. The campaign is trying to sort this stuff out, trying to hear all points of views and expose people to all points of views, and also to help people learn more about and provide, I hope, an on-ramp to learning more about what are the implications, for instance, that Beth's talking about this amount of public resources. What are the opportunities created that Mike talked about for individual parents that are just so compelling? And how do we get this all squared up? And also, how do we try to have a conversation about this that is that has some cooler heads and some cooler language, and really centers the interests of children and achievement and families. So you all have given us a tremendous start. I apologize. I know everybody had more to say. There's only so much oxygen in 90 minutes. I fear I used too much of it, so I apologize if that's the case. But this is, as we said, the first of many conversations that we'll be having. This is it's a real phenomenon in the world of education right now, and we really, really need to understand it and explore it and figure out what's going on. You all, Luis, Darrell, Colleen, Ben, Mike, and Beth give us a tremendous start, and we are deeply grateful to all of you. Thank you for Emily, to her work in putting this together, and to Sierra for helping pull this off. And I'm now going to wish everybody well and turn it back to Sierra to close us out and give us a preview of what's to come.
I'll come on and do that. Sierra. Thanks, John. What an incredible session. So I just want to say thank you again, and thank you to everybody who's joining us for your questions, and for our awesome panelists for responding to your questions, and for all of the really interesting conversation in the chat. So thank you for all of your participation. We're really glad that you've been here with us. So just coming up next week, we have another in our series, More for Hopeful Futures, or Children as Collateral Damage, this time focused on Head Start. We've all seen the headlines around that. Then the following week, we have a double header with a session, or Kindergarten Matters session, preparing children and families for kindergarten success, followed by the afternoon, a session on EdTech. The foundation of EdTech is connection, ensuring universal access to the internet. And then the following week on June 10th, join us for our Crucible of Practice, looking at what's working in rural communities. So thank you all. As a reminder, all of the multiple resources that were linked in the chat will be sent to you all, along with the recording and information from this session in a follow-up message later this week. So thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.